My name is Julia Sande, and I'm a human rights law and policy campaigner with Amnesty International Canada's English-speaking section. Amnesty International is a global movement of over 10 million people in over 170 countries working to protect and promote human rights. I'm joined today by Samer Muscati of Human Rights Watch and Emilio Rodriguez from Citizens for Public Justice. The federal government's budget plan is called Fairness for Every Generation. But contained in the final pages of the 660-page budget implementation bill is a plan to expand immigration detention into federal prisons. Bearing profoundly consequential changes to Canada's immigration and refugee protection system in a sprawling omnibus budget bill is not fairness for every generation. Limiting debate and failing to consult human rights advocates and people who have experienced immigration detention firsthand is not fairness for every generation. And detaining people seeking safety or a better life in facilities that are designed to punish is anything but fairness for every generation. Since 2016, the federal government has placed more than 45,000 people in immigration detention, including refugee claimants, families and children, and people with disabilities. People in immigration detention are held on administrative grounds, most commonly because a Canada Border Services Agency officer believes that they may not appear for an immigration or refugee proceeding. They may also be detained because authorities are not satisfied with their identity documents or for the purpose of an examination. In a small minority of cases, that is fewer than 10% of cases over the last 8 years, people in immigration detention are held on allegations of public safety concerns. These allegations are only tested by a tribunal that is not bound by any legal or technical rules of evidence. For some, previous interactions with the criminal justice system may be the reason that they are alleged to be a danger to the public. However, it's important to note that these individuals can only be transferred to immigration detention after the criminal justice system has determined that they should not be incarcerated, either because they received bail, their charges were dropped, or their sentence was served. If they were Canadian citizens, they would be free to return to their communities. Canada's immigration detention system, including the practice of using jails for immigration detention, has received widespread condemnation from international human rights groups, faith-based leaders, social justice organizations, healthcare providers, lawyers and academics, MPs and former ministers, as well as people who have experienced immigration detention. All 10 provinces, led by political parties across the spectrum, have indicated their firm opposition to the use of jails for immigration detention by cancelling their immigration detention agreements and arrangement with the federal government. Instead of following the province's lead, the federal government is doubling down on its rights-violating system. It plans to expand immigration detention into federal prisons. This is a violation of international human rights standards. These plans are deeply concerning for rights advocates, including Amnesty International, which for years have been pushing for an end to the incarceration of people in immigration detention. They are a step in the wrong direction by the federal government. The federal government intends to implement these changes through legislative amendments. Instead of allowing the proposed changes to be subjected to the normal scrutiny provided by the legislative process, the federal government is attempting to pass them through an omnibus budget bill. This will make it less likely that the horrific human rights impacts of the government's plans will receive the proper attention and scrutiny that they deserve. We are calling on the government to immediately cancel its plans to use federal prisons for immigration detention. Instead of investing in more incarceration, the federal government should expand community-based, rights-respecting alternatives to detention, which provide support rather than surveillance and are operated by local NGOs independently of CBSA. Samer Muscati of Human Rights Watch will now speak to some of the impacts of Canada's immigration detention system. He will be followed by Emilio Rodriguez of Citizens for Public Justice, who will share perspectives from faith-based advocates. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Hi, everyone. My name is Samer Muscati, and I'm the Acting Deputy Director of the Disability Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, a non-government organization that investigates violations of international human rights in about 100 countries around the world, including in Canada. As Julia noted, this bill is far from, and I quote, fairness for every generation. In fact, immigration detention has been harming many generations of newcomers in Canada, people and families for whom Canada represents a hope and a home. This bill is a betrayal of that hope and a betrayal of Canada's prided reputation as a rights-respecting safe haven for migrants and refugees. People in immigration detention are subjected to widespread human rights violations. They are regularly handcuffed, shackled, and held with little to no contact with the outside world. Because there is no legal limit on the duration of immigration detention, people are at risk of being incarcerated indefinitely. The longest instance of immigration detention in Canada lasted over 11 years and involved a man with an apparent mental health condition. Since 2016, more than 300 people have been locked up in immigration detention for longer than a year. Many of the people we've interviewed over the years for our research spoke of the profound uncertainty in immigration detention, especially the uncertainty about how long detention would last. For many people, this was a defining feature of their experience in immigration detention, the notion that they just couldn't know when life would get back to normal. They had no countdown to the date of release. That uncertainty can shred every last bit of hope that people hold on to while in immigration detention, and can create such an intense sense of powerlessness that many people contemplate taking their own lives. Since 2000, at least 17 people died in immigration detention, most of them incarcerated in a jail. Immigration detention is particularly devastating to people fleeing traumatic experiences and persecution in search of safety and protection in Canada. People in immigration detention can develop anxiety, depression, despair, psychological distress, psychosis, and catatonic withdrawal. One lawyer told us that the impact of immigration detention is not subtle. It, and I quote, really manifests itself in people shaking, screaming, not being able to sleep, not being able to function, end quote. People with mental health conditions also face discrimination throughout the immigration detention process, and they are subjected to disproportionately coercive treatment. In fact, CBSA continues to enforce a policy of incarcerating people with so-called mental health issues in provincial jails in order to provide, and I quote, access to specialized care. Shamefully, Immigration Minister Mark Miller doubled down on this policy last month when he indicated that prisons would now be used for people in CBSA custody who are, and I quote, high risk and have severe mental health problems. And by the government's own admission, the majority of so-called high-risk detainees are Black or racialized. CBSA has sweeping police powers and remains the only major law enforcement agency in the country without independent civilian oversight. And with this bill, the federal government is empowering the agency even more. Some of the most serious human rights violations happen to people who are out of sight and out of mind. This bill, which allows the federal government to expand immigration detention into federal penitentiaries, casts already marginalized people even further out of sight and out of mind. In 2021, we interviewed a young person who was detained in a jail, and his words have always stayed with me. He said, and I quote, "I was just waiting, praying, trying to convince myself that it's not that bad. I was thinking, they can't just leave me in here. And I didn't feel like a human in there. I felt like a dog. The guards would just open the latch to feed me." Before closing, I want to take this opportunity to thank the dozens of people who courageously shared with us their experiences, insights, and memories from their time in immigration detention. They deserve better from Canada. I urge the government to stop multiplying the trauma and pain the system creates and instead pave the way for a truly welcoming Canada for people seeking a better life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samer and Julia, for sharing, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to address this very important issue in this space. My name is Emilio Rodriguez. I'm the policy analyst for refugee and migrant rights at Citizens for Public Justice. We're a national progressive organization of members who are inspired by faith to act for social and environmental justice in Canadian public policy. We're on the eve of Mental Health Week, and the theme this year is Healing with Compassion. This theme is not foreign to this government. In 2016, this government rode into power on the wave of compassion for refugees. As Prime Minister Justin Trudeau declared at the time, and I quote, "To those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you, regardless of your faith." These values and principles are at the heart of our prided reputation as Canadians. But this government's plans to expand immigration detention into federal prisons is a deep betrayal of those prided values and principles of compassion, care, and the urgency to protect people seeking safety or a better life in Canada. In October 2021, alongside my friends from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, CPJ joined the Welcome to Canada campaign. The campaign moved from coast to coast, calling on provincial authorities to stop CVSA from using provincial jails for immigration detention. We issued an interfaith statement that was supported by 180 faith organizations and religious leaders from across the country from multiple faith traditions, denouncing this practice. This letter was accompanied by the support of also 30,000 people that participated in the campaign, including concerned Canadians across the country, hundreds of lawyers, scholars, healthcare providers, people who had lived experience of immigration detention, and dozens of leading Canadian and international organizations serving and working to protect the human rights of migrants and refugees. In the span of 20 months, all 10 provinces committed to ending the use of jails for immigration detention. In 5 provinces, this practice has already ended, and the rest are due to end in the coming months. This is not coincidence. We have broad support across the country to end this practice. I think we can all agree that there are controversial issues that come through Parliament, but this shouldn't be one of them. This is a clear, nonpartisan, human rights-based issue. And our campaign demonstrates that there is broad support across the country to end this practice and substitute it for some of the community-based alternatives that we have already mentioned. In response to the federal government's proposed expansion of immigration detention into federal prisons, last week the Bloc Québécois appealed to the government's humanity and called these proposed measures nonsense. The NDP also condemned these plans, calling them egregious human rights violations. For me, one of the most beautiful aspects of the campaign was seeing so many people come together from different faith traditions, including faith leaders across the country. As people of faith, we once again join in to call on the government to end the human rights violations in immigration detention that impact thousands of people every year. All of our religions teach the fundamental worth of every human being. We urge the federal government to recognize the gravity of this issue and change course in order to ensure that people seeking safety or a better life in Canada have the opportunity to heal with compassion. Thank you.
We will now be taking questions. We have questions online. If you are joining us online, please use the raise hand function now. Our first question is from Dylan Robertson. Please go ahead.
Well, hi there. Thanks for taking our questions today. I just wanted some clarity on what you're looking for here, because the news release talks about a phase out, and then at one point in the press conference, you said an end to immigration detention, and then more towards the end, you mentioned community-based alternatives. So I'm just trying to figure out what you're actually asking Ottawa to do here, and if you have any sort of response to the criticism that, you know, we actually need to have the option of immigration detention, to have an incentive for people to not just, you know, not show up for a deportation hearing.
Yeah, so the reason that we're here today is to talk about the federal government's plan to expand immigration detention into prisons. And so that is our current and most immediate call. On a longer term basis, we are calling on the government to work to end immigration detention because of the rights abuses and violations that take place within the system. But, you know, in talking to people who experienced detention, it was clear that the most pressing concern is getting out of jails and jail-like facilities. And so that is our key call on the federal government today. In terms of the longer term calls and your question about alternatives to detention, that's a way that the federal government can actually get on the path to ending immigration detention. So there are already amazing community-based organizations that work with newcomers and provide supports. And so we're encouraging that the government, instead of spending more money on incarceration, that they work to expand these organizations' capacity to provide supports. But to be clear, our immediate ask and the reason we're here today is in direct response to the federal government's plans to expand immigration detention to federal prisons.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I thought I was cutting you off there. I just had a follow-up question, and I'm so sorry to ask the question again. I just wanted to make sure that I've got it right. You said our immediate ask is about the decision to, expand this into the federal realm, but I didn't actually hear a verb. You're asking them to not expand it. You're asking them to divert these cases to community programming, or could you just articulate in a sentence with a verb what you're actually asking them to do about this policy other than don't do it?
Yeah, so I guess the verb could be cancel. So the federal government in its budget has tabled proposed changes to legislation to allow federal prisons to be used for immigration detention. They are not currently used. That is not something that takes place. And so they've announced this plan. They've tabled legislation to implement this plan. And so we're calling on them to cancel this plan. Does that answer?
I think so. And then those people would then go to the community-based alternatives, or they would lessen, the number of people that end up detained in the first place, I assume. That would be the logical following of not putting in this legislation, I guess, right?
That's right. I do want to clarify. So there are already immigration holding centers set up to house people in immigration detention. These are federal facilities. They operate like medium security prisons. We're advocating for an end to immigration detention, but the decision before the government today is not one between, ending the detention system altogether. What we're seeing is that they're trying to expand it, and we're looking for that to stop. We're also wanting to work with them to end the system, but it's not the case that they don't have any other facility or option available to them. We've seen this in response to all 10 provinces saying that immigration detention, can no longer take place in their provincial jails. And so there are still 3 federally run immigration holding centers that still exist. And so, those are also available for immigration detention. What we're talking about today, is an expansion of the immigration detention system into federal prisons.
Okay, I've got that sorted. Thank you. And if I can throw in one more question, I'm
Dylan,
sorry to keep going here.
Can we circle back to you, Dylan? We'll take another question first from Christian Smith. Please go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. Are you advocating for other changes that are or advocating against other changes that are included in the budget bill with respect to immigration? Or is it only on this one discrete issue about using federal prisons for immigration detention?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So we're certainly concerned by the method by which the government is planning to implement a number of changes. As you know, the budget was tabled yesterday, and so some of these changes are very complex, and we haven't yet had the time to digest what all of these are. But that sort of speaks to our concerns about the system. The government has talked about speeding up removals, and so we're certainly very anxious and concerned to see that this will still be done in accordance with international human rights law. And we're concerned that all of these changes are being rammed through a budget bill where, we won't have the opportunity to engage in the same way. They're not consulting with human rights advocates or other experts. And so, I wish I could say more, and I am happy to follow up once we've had a time to digest more of the bill.
If I can add too, I think that the reason why we're organizing this so swiftly today, and then we're speaking about the issues, because it's such a strong reversal of the progress that, or a proposed reversal of the progress that we have achieved over the last couple of years. I think that in addition to the points and the recommendations that Julia highlighted, we want to see more oversight. We want to see more scrutiny around this practice. The data suggests that 91% of the people that are detained by CVSA are detained due to flight risk. That's a vast majority. And as Julia mentioned before, even the small minority that's considered a danger to the public, the reasons behind that are sometimes not fully justified. So overall, I think what we want to see is, again, a cancellation of this proposed plan that goes against the recommendation of human rights organizations, the movement from different provinces, from all Canadian provinces that have vowed to end this practice in provincial facilities. And I think there are several other issues that we can consider, such as oversight mechanisms to CVSA. But we are very appalled by this particular measure in the bill, and that's the reason why we're focusing almost entirely on that in this press conference today.
Thank you.
No follow-up, Christian?
Well, I would say, has the government been transparent enough about what it's doing with the immigration system in this bill? Have you actually figured out what they're changing?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer broadly. I mean, the legislation is broad and complex. So from an initial read, I think it'll require time to digest. We certainly hope for and expect a technical briefing. And, as far as transparency goes, it's something that we wish we would have been consulted on before rather than kind of surprised and left to scramble when the budget is tabled. And so, yeah, I think the use of an omnibus budget bill and mixing all of these issues into the issue of the budget kind of really limits the transparency because attentions are scattered and it doesn't allow the kind of scrutiny and transparency that we would like to see and expect from the government.
We'll circle back around for a second round of questions. Dylan, please go ahead. Dylan, we can't hear you if you are speaking.
Oh, sorry, I have to unmute myself. Look at that. Sorry. And sorry to ask so many questions. I just wanted to get your characterization of federal incarceration as well, because I understand that, the provincial jails aren't sunshine and lollipops either, but it seems like the risk to people detained in these circumstances, particularly people who might not know anything about the justice system in Canada, it seems like there's a nexus to risk, at least in some of the reporting, that throwing a foreigner in a federal prison kind of is a different beast than in a provincial one.
Yeah, so we're concerned about the use of any sort of jail or prison. Immigration detention is meant to be administrative. It's not meant to be punitive. And it's supposed to be separate from the criminal justice system. And so we're concerned about it taking place in any sort of jail or jail-like facility, prisons included. And yeah, people talk about coming to Canada, sometimes fleeing persecution, sometimes having very difficult journeys here, and talking about feeling a sense of safety and relief when they arrive, only to be thrown in a jail and, not understand why. They haven't been charged or convicted of a crime. They don't have the same protections in place. If you're convicted or charged with a criminal offense, the government has to prove on a very high standard, whereas for immigration detention, that doesn't exist. And so it's very, very difficult for people, and they talk about the deep despair they feel of being thrown in jail. And, Samer mentioned it, but when you're serving a sentence for a conviction under the criminal code, you can count down to a date of release. When you're in immigration detention, you don't have that. You don't know how long you're going to be there, and that's very, very challenging for people. And so, we're pushing for movement away from these kind of carceral settings, prisons, jails. It's not that one's okay and the other isn't. It's that none of them are okay. None of them align with human rights standards. And so that's why we're looking for the government to cancel this plan.
Right, and just as a follow-up, if I understand correctly, though, a lot of the federal prisons are for more severe sentences. Like, I know that there's such a thing as a higher security provincial prison, but is it not correct that the decision in this budget is going to result in people showing up, locked up with people who are facing much more severe, much more violent offenses?
Yeah, so I certainly don't want to be stigmatizing towards people serving sentences for criminal convictions, but I think in talking to people in immigration detention, they talk about, expressing fear over the setting that they're in jails. You're right that prisons are reserved for sentences that are 2 years or longer. It appears that there's something in the bill that envisions kind of a separate section of the prison to be used for immigration detention, but that leads us to concerns about people being isolated and not being able to access services.
And we'll take our last question from Christian Smith. Please go ahead.
Hi, so are you aware of what kind of abuses do take place in immigration detention? And are you concerned that this bill putting immigration detainees into prisons will lead to a violation of their rights or their rights to be free from unreasonable search or seizure, that kind of thing? I mean, the prison, the CBSA, and in exigent circumstances, prison officials are going to be able to do certain things to the detainees. Are you aware or concerned about that?
I can share briefly about some of the things that I noted in the investigation done by Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, and my colleagues can complement on that. But some of the testimonies spoke about detention for indefinite periods of time, sometimes multiple years. Some noted also solitary confinement and conditions that were incredibly restricted and punitive in nature. And the research also found that people with psychosocial disabilities and racialized individuals were more prone to this type of discrimination and abuse. So I think that those are some of the glaring examples of abuse that can take place. But I'm sure that my colleagues and also people that are in the front lines and that visit these centers can also share about a lot of the other concerns that we have. I think it's correct to point out that a change like this would expose people to more of these human rights violations.
Do you have a follow-up, Christian?
No.
That concludes the press conference. Thank you.